Young women, particularly prostitutes, are widely known as the serial killer's most likely target. Yet with all the attention to female victims, the public sometimes forgets that more than a third of all those murdered are male. Back in the late 1970s, when the bodies of young men began turning up near Southern California freeways, parents were reminded that their sons could be just as vulnerable as their daughters.
You get more bodies and more bodies, and finally, I would say in late 1979, you realize that there was a mass killer out there.
CBS 2 reporter Dave Lopez began covering the gruesome murders of the so-called Freeway killer.
The freeway played such an important part because it was so easy to get away. I mean, you know, you could drive forever in different freeway exchanges.
Complicating the investigation, bodies were scattered widely over several counties with inconsistent patterns of evidence.
And then you had those who were badly tortured. Then you had those that weren't tortured. Then you had those that were thrown when the car was moving. Then you had those that weren't thrown.
In 1979, the killer began targeting boys as young as 12, picking them up hitchhiking or simply snatching them off the street.
Some of them were stabbed. Most of them were strangled. Some of them had signs of being tortured.
For Detective Bernie Esposito, each corpse held clues to the killer's evil personality.
The thing that stands out in my mind is the pain that he inflicted on these young boys and the callous disregard he had for their feelings, for their families, for their lives, for their being. You know, he treated them strictly as some type of a sex object which was there only for his pleasure and his gratification. Then it continued to evolve to a point where his sexual gratification actually came from the killing of these young boys.
The fear that began to grip Southern California affected even seasoned cops like Esposito.
I looked across the breakfast table at my 14-year-old son and just imagine how I would feel if someone came knocking at my door in the middle of the night telling me that my son had been found brutally murdered and left in some field like a bag of trash.
Frustrated by a lack of interagency coordination, a half-dozen detectives created their own informal task force.
My partner and I joined up with 2 detectives from LAPD and 2 detectives from the LA Sheriff's Department, and we just kind of became a rather close-knit group, the 6 of us, and started to put all of the information we had together and work together as a 6-man team.
The Freeway killer continued to forge a bloody trail until detectives got the break they needed in June 1980. 19-year-old David McVicker came forward to say that he suspected the killer might be Uильям Бонин, a local truck driver who had raped McVicker 5 years earlier.
And McVickers tells me how after Bonin had done everything he wanted to do with him, he dumped him out and he says, "You know what, you're an all right guy. I was going to kill you, but I want to come back for you and use you again."
The detectives discovered that Bonin had been convicted of molesting 5 other boys back in 1969. Psychiatrists had declared him an untreatable sex offender, but 5 years later, he'd been released. Soon after, Bonin raped McVicker, for which he spent 3 more years behind bars. Now, with new information, detectives put Bonin under 24-hour surveillance.
It was on an evening that LAPD had a surveillance team on Bonin that he picked up a young boy, took him into a parking lot, and began to have sex with the young boy, and the officers could hear sounds coming out of the van that disturbed them.
And the police almost waited a little too long. I mean, this kid was in the throes of being strangled in the back of that van.
Fibers from Bonin's van tied him to a number of the killings.
We didn't really need his cooperation to convict him, but we needed his cooperation to try to determine who he killed versus who someone else killed.
Hoping to avoid the death penalty, Bonin led police to a missing body and detailed 21 chilling murders on tape.
He was trying to stop me from stabbing him, and I was just stabbing, just to stab. Stuck him in different places with the knife. Because I didn't know where to stab. You know, I don't know where vital organs are or anything like that.
One of the things that struck me is that he was sitting there telling you in graphic detail how he brutalized sexually abused and murdered these young boys, like he was talking about yesterday's news. I mean, it was just incredible, the lack of emotion that he showed while he was describing all these murders.
There was pain inflicted, yes, like squeezing of the nuts and stuff like that, but not a constant thing. I said, I'm going to choke you till you're unconscious, and that's it. And I choked him, and that was it.
Dave Lopez scored an exclusive when the Freeway killer granted him a jailhouse interview.
It was like someone threw cold water on my face, listening to a guy sitting there describing to you how he killed people and why he killed people. Oh, the kid looked, he was an easy target. It was a game, that kind of stuff. You know, how he would have sex on the bed, on his mother's bed with the kid and then kill him.
Bonin claimed that he'd been sexually assaulted himself as a young boy while in juvenile detention.
I asked him, I said, what happens if you don't get caught? And I remember he looked at me and said, I'd still be killing. He couldn't stop. He said that about 4 or 5 times. I couldn't stop.
Police also arrested 2 accomplices, Vernon Butts and James Monroe.
I looked at her and I said, can you go through with it? And he says, yeah. So he I asked him, I believe, get on top of him and hold his hands, and he held his hands, and I strangled him until he was dead.
James Monroe was given 15 years to life in prison. Before he could be brought to trial, Vernon Butts hanged himself in his cell. Uильям Бонин was convicted of 14 murders and sentenced to die by lethal injection.
He said he'd been in prison enough that he wasn't afraid of prison, but he was terrified of the death penalty. He told me that. He says, I don't want to die.
On February 23, 1996, after Uильям Bonin's appeals were exhausted, the notorious Freeway killer was finally executed.
He never told me why he enjoyed killing. He just said he liked the sound of kids dying. Other than that, he could give no other reason.
Next.